Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Jenny Rushlow. I'm the Interim Graduate School Dean and Associate Dean for Environmental Programs at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Welcome to our presentation today. Each talk is worth 1 Vermont CLE credit. So if you'd like to claim credits for this and other talks this summer, just keep track of those credits for your records. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation today. And if you're watching on the VLGS YouTube page or on Facebook, you can enter your questions into the chat or comment space. And you don't have to wait until the end of the talk to do that. You can do it as you think of them at any point, and we'll get through as many as we can during the Q&A period. Today, we're very pleased to welcome incoming Dean Blake Hudson. Professor Blake Hudson is Dean of Cumberland College of Law at Samford University. Previously, he served as the Samuel T. Dell Professor of Law and the co-director of the Environmental and Land Use Law program at the University of Florida, Levin College of Law. He has a multitude of articles published across law reviews and a variety of legal and peer-reviewed journals. He's the author of the book, Constitutions and the Commons, the Impact of Federal Governance on Local, National, and Global Resource Management. And he's currently working on a comprehensive book on public and private forest science, law, policy, and management. He joins us this summer as our 2022 Distinguished Environmental Law Scholar at Vermont Law and Graduate School. And today his talk is titled, The Righteous Divide in American Policymaking. Please join me in welcoming Dean Blake Hudson.
Well, thank you so much, Jenny. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's been such a pleasure to be part of the VLS community for this week, and I'll be here next week. I think so very highly of your law school and its dedication to environmental protection and training of the next generation of environmental lawyers. And so grateful for the opportunity. I'm going to keep my comments, I think, relatively short, so we have plenty of time for discussion. But I have been thinking for some time about how, like so much of our public discourse, science has become politicized and vice versa. And I use science broadly here to include the use or misuse of economics or any other data-driven field to support political positions. And I've recently written an article on this topic that's not going to go to print for a few months, so feedback is welcome. It's based on the work of behavioral psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And his book gives us a glimpse into how the lack of nuance on the complexity of scientific and economic phenomena often cuts in both political directions. So you can imagine environmental activists that support coastal restoration or the restoration of river systems to benefit salmon, or that oppose cutting down forests, or that resist land development initiatives or seek to have coal-fired power plants shut down. These are exactly the types of causes that one might expect environmental groups to take up. But in some circumstances, what if by doing so, these environmental groups can cause more harm than good? What if this activism results in stranded assets in the coastal zone as sea levels rise, or more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and increased urban sprawl? Now, you can imagine conservative groups that advocate for personal responsibility and independence from the government, that argue for the sanctity of life and against abortion, for private corporations to be free to make investment choices without government interference. These are exactly the positions you might expect conservative groups to take. But what if these conservatives then oppose distributed solar generation? Even though homeowners gaining energy independence by separating from a government-run electric grid is the definition of personal responsibility. What if they resist mercury pollution regulations that could save the lives of infants living near coal-fired power plants? Is that not a pro-life issue? What if conservatives encourage the federal Department of Justice to place political pressure on companies planning to divest from fossil fuels and to coerce them not to do so? That sounds more like a tactic of communist totalitarian government than an approach that would be supported by principled U.S. conservatives. And so I'm going to briefly describe for you each of these examples and detail some of the reasons why these groups take these counterintuitive positions based upon Haidt's work, and then discuss ways in which we can work around, or hopefully we can try to work around, some of the political predispositions to reject inconvenient truths or in certain forms of science and things like that. So the first example I give, and I kind of take these, this talk invariably irritates everybody because I'm trying to be fair and equal to talk about kind of three conservative examples and three liberal examples. And I want to be clear that not everybody fits into those categories. And those categories, what do those even mean, right? And, because there's a lot of nuance that goes into even using labels like that. So bear with me. I understand there's a lot of nuance that's left out when we use terms like that. But I think these examples hopefully will make clear. So when I think about what could be framed as certain liberal groups' rejection of science, one example would be the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan. So I taught at LSU for a number of years and was actually kind of involved in commenting on and working with people who were working on this Louisiana Coastal Master Plan. A lot of people don't realize that the Louisiana coast has the highest rate of relative sea level rise in the world, because at the same time that sea levels are rising at an accelerated rate, the land is sinking because the Mississippi River being dammed up, as it used to meander all along Louisiana's coast and drop sediment and build land up. But since it's been levied, it's now sending all that dirt off the outer continental shelf, and it's not building land anymore. And so the land is sinking. So Louisiana put together a master plan that said we're going to use $50 billion over the next 50 years. Where they're going to get the money from, they didn't say. But to invest in coastal restoration projects along the coast of Louisiana. And, this sounds horrible, but I guess lucky for their funding, they were able to get some money from BP after the BP oil spill that has been allocated for these projects. Most of the projects are dealing with trying to restore the coast and like human built projects to increase sediment, deposition. They don't really deal with retreat from the coast in any meaningful way. And so what ends up happening there is they're talking about having putting in sediment diversions from the Mississippi River. So they open up a portion of a dam or a levee to have sediment deposit in wetlands. Well, there's a lot of scientists in the area who have done research studies to show that you can't just dump a bunch of nutrients into a wetland and have it build land in a successful way. A lot of times what happens is it ends up eutrophying the wetland and killing a lot of the species in the wetland, which actually hastens erosion. And so there's a lot of concern amongst scientists about the efficacy of some of the projects that have been proposed in the Louisiana Master Plan. Now, some of the projects, have been shown to potentially work, but I think the concern is amongst the scientific community is that they're using a hatchet, instead of a scalpel to decide which projects should go forward and which ones should not. And so you have a lot of environmental groups in the area who are like, yes, coastal restoration, that sounds great. Let's build the land. Let's keep the sea at bay. Let's restore wetlands. And that all sounds really good. But, there's good evidence that you could invest a lot of money in those projects. And then 50 years from now, it was just wasted money. It was just flushing it down the toilet, quite literally, because the projects don't succeed. And so that's the concern. And, they did a study that showed that 84% of Louisiana support the coastal master plan. And I guarantee you 84% of Louisianans are not card-carrying members of the Sierra Club, but they do want to see the coast saved. And so if you're a politician who says, we're going to save your coast, we're going to invest in these projects that, eventually fail 50 years from now, you're going to get elected today over the person who says, you know what, this might not be supported by the science. We'd be better off investing that money, helping you retreat from the coast and move away from the coast. You're going to lose that election, given the high percentage of people who support the program. And so, that's just one example of kind of rejecting science when it's not in line with kind of what you feel should happen. The second example is one that's kind of near and dear to my heart because I write a lot about forest management and wood pellet usage for electricity generation. And so across the southeastern U.S., you have seen an increase in wood pellet processing facilities. And basically what this is companies are mostly taking scrap off of forest floors, scrap from sawmills and things like that, and they're processing them and turning them into these little wood pellets that they then put on a ship and send over to England and other parts of the world to fire what previously were coal-fired electricity generation stations. And, it wouldn't be viable in a place like England, but for heavy subsidies by the government. Drax Biomass has supporting one of their electricity generating facilities that I think 5 of their 6 boilers have now converted over to coal-fired power. And there's a lot of concern and just concern amongst the environmental community that what about the some evidence that some of these forest operations are going into old growth or lowland wetland type areas in North Carolina and taking timber and whatnot. There's environmental justice concerns about where these facilities are sited because they're often sited in low income communities. I mean, the whole suite of issues that are very real that affect pretty much any industry are cropping up when it comes to wood pellets. One of the controversies, though, has been about, is this carbon neutral, right? So there's a big debate. There's Schlesinger and others at Duke who have said this is not good for the climate because it takes, they use these metrics like it takes 75 years to recoup the carbon that's burned from a tree for it to grow back. And what I've discovered in my own research is that they're kind of cherry picking their examples. They're not thinking about most of the southeastern U.S. that where these industry that would support this industry is like on land, like in Alabama, where I'm from, that's already kind of monoculture pine plantation. Those trees grow back within 15 to 20 years relatively quickly. And so they recoup that amount, the carbon that was emitted through burning it very quickly, relatively quickly. And there's a lot of other data out there from other scientists, and it's not like the climate debate where they go get 1 or 2 kind of contrarians to post bad science. There's a legitimate body of literature debate about what the life cycle is of these wood pellets. And once the economic analysis is looked at, which is what I'm concerned with, you see that you actually have an opportunity to expand forest land on the currently unforested lands by creating a market to put these wood pellets into. And so the point is there's a scientific debate, and we need to study it. And if the science shows that wood pellets are on net worse for climate change, then we need to think about that and regulate it. On the other hand, the point that I run up against all the time with people is they don't understand that sometimes cutting trees actually helps the forest to motivate people to plant more trees. I especially find people in places where there's lots of federal land or places where there are lots of restrictions at the state level on private land. They tend to think that if you don't allow it to go into wood pellet production, then it'll remain a forest. But that's not the case in the Southeast. The Southeast produces more timber than any other nation on the globe. if you take away the market for timber products, that 1,000-acre forest is very likely to become a 1,000-acre soybean farm. And so you could have a net loss of carbon sequestration capabilities to combat climate change by not burning wood pellets or having markets to put those into. There are other markets, there's pulp and paper and whatnot, but a lot of that has shifted overseas. And so, long story short, this is another area where we need to slow down and think about, well, maybe cutting trees is better and allowing it to be used for wood pellets. And it displaces coal with all the co-pollutants. There's an argument about whether coal or wood is more efficient from a carbon dioxide perspective, but a lot of people are saying, you know, if you burn wood pellets and then you replant the forest and then you expand the forest, you actually create a closed loop of renewable energy, as opposed to burning fossil resources that you can never recoup over human timeframes. And so that's another example where there's a lot of pushback amongst environmental groups about just because it's cutting trees, and they tend to kind of knee-jerk or assume that means it's worse for climate. The third example is genetically modified organisms. And I know this can be a controversial example, but there's, you know, Monsanto has done terrible things, and so therefore everything they do is terrible. It's kind of the feeling there. You know, one example is that I was surprised by. There's a professor at Arizona State named Gary Marchand. He talks all the time about how, you know, there's no evidence that anybody has suffered, there's been any human harm from a genetically modified organism, whereas you have a certain number of deaths every year associated with organic farming. You know, whether it's arsenic pollution or from natural arsenic seeping into resources and things like that. And so, you know, he's kind of baffled by this pushback against GMOs. And one example that he talks about is, you know, every year up to 500,000 children go blind from vitamin A deficiency. And within a year, half of these children die. Most are in Southeast Asia, where rice is a staple. It's because rice does not contain beta carotene, which produces vitamin A when it's digested. In the late 1990s, scientists created a beta carotene laden rice. It's called golden rice. Anti-GMO groups, including Greenpeace and others, opposed it in full force. When there was a few arguments that the GMOs put forth that were proven to be false, they shifted to other arguments, you know, kind of rejecting the scientific literature time and time again. But they were successful in having studies on the health impacts of golden rice shut down. They even went so far as to destroy fields of rice being grown in the Philippines. And this experience turned former anti-GMO activist and environmental writer Mark Linus away from rejecting GMOs outright. Linus stated, probably the angriest I've ever felt was when anti-GMO groups destroyed fields of golden rice growing in the Philippines. To see a crop that had such obvious life-saving potential ruined. And golden rice is still not commercially available. Not one person has been proven to be harmed from the innovation, but a number of children have gone blind or died from a lack of life-saving vitamin A that they've been prevented from ingesting in the meantime. And so that's just one example. And obviously, you know, there are different types of GMOs, but there seems to be some which sound a little scarier and shadier than others. But the point is that there's kind of this pushback against the science. Even though the science shows that a lot of these are safe, there's been a knee-jerk reaction against GMOs. Now, on the conservative side, when we think about opposition to renewable energy. So Troy Rule has written some really interesting articles about dark money and solar. And he talks about how in Arizona, for example, after the Citizens United case, previously their public utility commission races were not very big affairs. But there was a race where two Republican people wanted to get on the PUC, and after Citizens United, all these companies started funneling in millions of dollars into their campaign, like 100 times more money than had ever been spent on a public utility campaign before. And once those two parties were elected, they agreed to increase the penalty on solar users by, I think, 5 times the amount that it was before. So you're using the utilities lines and whatnot, therefore you owe a penalty. And so they increased this penalty. And the whole point there is that, how are you going to talk about personal responsibility and being free of the government and self preservation, and then penalize people who try to go off grid with solar? It's very contrary to principles that conservatives might otherwise put forth. Another example is which I know is in the forefront of everyone's minds right now with the Dobbs case, but is the sanctity of life issue and mercury pollution. So after the EPA decided to ratchet up standards for mercury pollution, there were a lot of pushback from conservative groups and even evangelical conservative groups about how this was big government run amok and too much regulation and whatnot. Even though, the data shows that by reducing mercury pollution, there's so many fewer premature births a year, and so many of those premature births result in death, right? And so it's like, it's this inconsistency with the views that are espoused by a certain group that with what the data is showing, that babies are actually dying from mercury pollution, right? And then the last example on the conservative side is the interference with fossil fuel divestment. You've had a lot of discussions about divestment from entities that have carbon emissions or invest in energy companies and things like that, with a lot of the universities and other entities kind of discussing divestment. And so what you had was this really bizarre situation last year, or a couple years ago, where a group of Republican senators and Congress people wrote a letter encouraging the DOJ to investigate these divestiture movements and penalize companies for making private decisions about who to invest with or not. And it's just bizarro world in the sense that is high level government interference with private entities' decisions, which typically, the conservative talking point is that the government shouldn't be involved in those types of interferences. And so this is just another example of kind of, going against the science and going against things when it interferes with some, even if it's inconsistent with some pre-existing worldview that you have. And so this is where Jonathan Haidt comes in. So those are just the examples. So let me give some disclaimers here, because people have pretty strong feelings about this. Jonathan Haidt is not 100% correct, and so it's just a framework within which we can analyze these things to see if we can glean something and learn something from his work. There's disagreement amongst behavioral psychologists about some of his conclusions. His studies, though, if you read The Righteous Mind, are robust, and he's proven the things that he's shown have been replicated time and time again. But just saying that, it's not that I'm necessarily putting forth it as the truth or the gold standard, but it is an interesting lens through which we can view these controversies and how to kind of overcome these issues. So Haidt's work lends strong support to the conclusion that moral intuitions come first and strategic reasoning comes second. So he uses this metaphor of an elephant and its rider to describe the relationship between moral reasoning and moral intuition. The elephant's moral intuition, while the rider is moral reasoning. And while moral reasoning can sway moral intuition, according to Haidt, the same way that a rider can guide an elephant, the weight of moral intuition, like an elephant, carries a lot of inertia toward our ultimate destination or our conclusion about an issue. So to change someone or some group's mind about a political issue, Haidt recommends that we talk to the elephant first. because he says, quote, if you ask people to believe something that violates their intuitions, they will devote their efforts to finding a reason to doubt your argument or your conclusion, and they will almost always succeed. So Haidt recognizes 6 basic moral foundations that people rely upon to shape their worldview and to make intuitive judgments that carry a great deal of inertia, and therefore they often overcome reason. I'm going to share my screen here with you and show you kind of the one chart where he details this. And each of these is here paired with its opposite number. So care, which would, the opposite of that is harm, fairness and cheating, liberty, oppression, loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, and sanctity, degradation. So as you can see in the chart, and again, he's replicated this through so many different studies, the further to the left one identifies as, the more likely they are to rely upon the care and certain iterations of the fairness and liberty foundations almost entirely. Research both in the US and abroad concludes that the moral matrix of liberals everywhere rests disproportionately more, and it's actually lots more, on the care foundation than does the matrix of conservatives. The further to the right a person is, the more likely they are to rely on all 6 foundations, with the addition of loyalty, authority, and sanctity in relatively equal parts. So again, this is not a right or wrong. It's not saying that conservatives do a better job because they use all 6 and liberals do a worse job because they have the 2. It's just, that's not what the point is. The point is just that they use these things to make moral judgments to different degrees, with conservatives tending to use all 6 in somewhat equal part, and liberals tending to rely on care and fairness more. So he basically says that liberals have a 3 foundation morality and conservatives have 6. So not only do liberals and conservatives rely on different components of the moral matrices, but they also interpret specific moral foundations differently. So for example, liberals tend to associate fairness with equality. Like it's what is fair is having everybody treated equally, whereas conservatives view fairness as proportionality. So people being rewarded proportional to whatever it is that they contributed, even if unequal outcomes result. So the 2 groups even view fairness very differently. And after adjusting to account for this, Haidt refines his analysis to conclude that liberals actually base their moral worldview almost entirely on care, liberty, and fairness when it's understood as equality. When fairness is limited to proportionality as opposed to equality, then it becomes a part of the conservative moral framework to a greater degree than liberals. He also has some other observations about liberals being more willing to sacrifice fairness as proportionality if it conflicts with compassion or fighting oppression, while conservatives are more willing to sacrifice care to promote some of the other 5 foundations. There are even differences in how liberals and conservatives understand sanctity. While sanctity on the right might be commonly associated with conservative religious leanings, on the left, it may manifest as viewing degradation of nature as an offense brought about by industrialist capitalism, for example. So there's a sanctity element on the left also. So while conservatives and liberals may have different defaults, that is the kind of the nature versus nurture, this is the nature side on these issues, Haidt raises some environmental, the nurture side, drivers for why each side's elephant has become harder to steer via reason. The first he talks about is a lack of accountability. So Phil Tetlock is a leading researcher on accountability. He defines accountability as the explicit expectation that one will be called upon to justify one's beliefs, feelings, or actions to others, and the expectation that a person will be rewarded or punished based upon the strength of the justification. One of Tetlock's experiments asked participants to study a legal case and make an inference about whether the party was guilty or innocent. Some of this group were told that they'd have to explain their decisions to others, while others knew that they would not have to explain their decision about guilty or innocent to others. Tetlock found that the unaccountable group demonstrated typical cognitive errors, including laziness and reliance on gut feelings. The group who knew that they had to explain their reasoning to others engaged in a more systematic and critical thinking, and they were less likely to jump to premature conclusions and more likely to revise their beliefs in response to evidence. However, this group's more careful reasoning was exploratory in nature, so which means an even-handed consideration of alternative points of view, rather than confirmatory thought, which would be considered a one-sided attempt to rationalize a particular point of view, only when three conditions were present. So if the decision makers learned before forming an opinion that they're going to be accountable to an audience, if the audience's views were unknown, and if the party believed the audience was well informed and interested in accuracy, then they were more likely to not just engage in confirmatory thought. If those conditions were not present, though, if you think your audience is a bunch of idiots, or you kind of know how they lean, or you don't know that you're going to be accountable at the time that you undertake your own review of the information, then the accountability pressures simply increase confirmatory thought. So people try harder to look right than to be right. And so, there's been a decided erosion of accountability in the US since at least the mid-1990s. In 1995, Republican Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, changed the congressional work week from 5 days to 3. He encouraged members of Congress to live in their home districts in a not-so-veiled effort to prevent fraternizing with members of the Democratic Party. There would be no more socializing with other congressional families on weekends, fewer lunches with other congressional members during the week. Columbia psychology professor Peter Coleman argues that what Gingrich did was, quote, remove a basic structure from Washington community life that had served as a civilizing force in our government for over a century. It was a removal of bonds that are formed in the locations, memberships, and institutions, the playgrounds, schools, little league teams, places of worship, places of work, and so on, where families from different political parties grow up together. These were the interactions where members of Congress often became more moderate as they and their families befriended members of the other side. Ultimately, this loss of accountability had contributed to some of the partisanship we see today. Members of Congress and families had far fewer opportunities to justify their beliefs, feelings, and actions to those who had different political preferences. Instead, they went back home to be with like-minded people who would not challenge those beliefs, feelings, or actions. So we've seen the same phenomenon in the geographical self-sorting of Americans based on political ideology, the so-called big sort, or the clustering of like-minded America. The increased mobility of the average American means more freedom to choose where we live. The percentage of Americans living in areas where elections are won in landslides has gone up dramatically in recent decades. It's a proxy, obviously, for the proportion of like-minded and like-voting people in an area. In 1980, 4% of Americans lived in landslide counties. In 2020, 35% of Americans lived in landslide counties. Again, a lack of accountability reinforces pre-existing worldviews and leaves one to entrench within their perpetually unchallenged policy positions. It's no surprise then that the percentage of Democratic Party members who view Republicans very unfavorably rose from 16% in 1994 to 38% in 2014, while the percentage of Republican Party members who viewed the Democratic Party very unfavorably similarly rose from 17% to 43%. The second environmental factor, and then I want to obviously leave time for questions, but the second environmental factor related to the first is the growing identification with teams. So a lack of accountability to someone with opposing worldview or moral matrix leads to the creation of and dedication to your team, tribalism, if you will. One of the most compelling aspects of Haidt's analysis is his transparency about his own journey, being a kind of liberal social psychologist who for a long time kind of castigated the other side and didn't want to give any credence to the other side's positions. But he eventually changed his approach while studying in India, while he still disagreed that the policy methods preferred by conservatives would actually achieve desirable social outcomes. He at least kind of escaped his partisan mindset and could understand how conservatives could believe those things. Haidt became critical of his own field, consisting of explanations for what was wrong with conservatives, and the issue of teams forming out of like-minded individuals maintaining the same moral intuitions came to Haidt the source of so much of our growing political polarization. Groups love teammates and they hate traitors. And they treat those who they view as traitors worse than enemies. So they actually, if you're a traitor to your team, you're actually worse than the other team, which is really what you see with Liz Cheney and other people right now on the January 6th committee who are trying to hold to account the horrible events of that day. So a party who questions an environmentalist group's conclusions might be dealt with more unforgivingly than an anti-environmentalist. Though to be clear, this is a representation of the loyalty principle that you see here on the slide. It's one that tends to be relied upon more heavily by those on the right. So American liberals relying heavily on the CARE Foundation are critical of American foreign policy that tends toward military conflict, for example. That activates the loyalty foundation in conservatives who look at liberals as traitors to the country. It's just one of those stereotypical examples. Though I personally have experienced this phenomenon in two circumstances. One is when I'm advocating for environmental policy or strong action on climate change, for example, in conservative or religious circles. Environmental issues have become so politicized, particularly among some religious groups, that one might be viewed as speaking heresy when advocating for policies strongly supported by liberals or non-religious groups. Al Gore believes that. How can you believe it, or whatever, right? But I've experienced it from the other side as well, as an environmentalist who understands that markets are critical to reforestation of the South, right? So I've written a few op-eds on this topic, and I've had to stop reading the comments because it's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cut more trees down to save them, you idiot, you know, and I'm like, yeah, actually you do have to do that in certain parts of the country, like the South, where people are going to cut the trees down if you don't give them a way to put those into markets, because there's not any government regulation, nor will there be any government regulation at the state level forthcoming anytime soon. So ultimately, the pull of team affiliation in our hyperpolarized society is affecting our ability to even talk about different policy responses, much less legislate them. Okay, so last thing, then I'll stop. How do we honestly address important policy problems in areas where political action seems impossible because of these behavioral predispositions? So the first is not anything necessarily new. It's what I call associational messaging, but it's an outgrowth of the vouchers theory of risk communication put forth by Dan Kahan and others, whereby trusted members of an individual's cultural group help convince others in that group that information conforms with the group's pre-existing worldview. So co-author and I termed associational messaging, which is not the conveyance of information by a member of the same cultural group, which is a pure voucher, but rather conveyance of information about organizations that the cultural group, in our case, Southern climate change skeptics, are likely to identify with, in the hope that that conveyance will help assuage their skepticism. So we suggested highlighting in mass media the climate change mitigation efforts undertaken by the US military, right? Which is conservatives tend to support. There's specific Fortune 500 companies which represent the private sector, the free market, that many conservatives generally support, that are taking climate actions. The insurance industry also represents private free market. They're out there to make money, not to bake up some fake climate science. And so you can trust that if they say climate change is man-made and is going to cause great disruption to markets, then you can trust that. And then even sports and recreation groups and related industries, outdoor groups, hunting and fishing groups, college and professional sports. NASCAR has a number of climate-related policies, for example, just making people aware of groups that they associate with who are taking this very seriously. And these efforts can help forge acceptance of science among groups identifying with those entities. Similar tactics could be used in the context of GMOs, wood pellets, coastal restoration, mercury pollution, solar energy, and divestment. The second role is our second potential approach is the role of private governance, written about by Mike Vandenberg at Vanderbilt and others, whereby private organizations perform traditionally governmental functions. Private governance solutions result when private actors like corporations, households, universities, hospitals, and churches take on roles we traditionally think of as governmental. These scholars have highlighted the profound impact that Google, Apple, Coca-Cola, Walmart, Goldman Sachs, and others can have on reducing carbon emissions, as evidenced by early results from policies they put into place. Private governance has the potential to reduce emissions by 1 billion tons per year for the next decade, which can buy enough time until strong government action becomes a viable solution. And it's also related to the suggestions I made regarding associational messaging, because Vandenberg finds that conservatives and moderates are more supportive of climate change mitigation when exposed to information about mitigation actions taken by the private sector. Though I don't have time to go into it here, private governance can do a lot to address policy pitfalls regarding GMOs, wood pellets, coastal restoration, mercury pollution, solar energy, and so on. And then finally, last thing, we just have to be better about self-reflection, self-criticism, challenge our own logical fallacies that we fall into, and just be better citizens when it comes to digesting and forming perspectives on science and its role in policymaking, regardless of what side of the political spectrum we fall on. And we just need to do a better job of listening to each other. But I welcome your questions and thoughts, and thank you for giving me a chance to speak with you today.
Great, thank you. That was fascinating. Okay, so for our Q&A, we do have a few minutes to spend on some questions from the audience. And again, you can enter your questions into the chat or the comment space on YouTube or on Facebook, and we'll get through as many as we can. So to kick things off, what are your thoughts on how the US political arena can close the polarizing divide? And do you have any thoughts on whether the local, state, or federal governments are best positioned to help do that?
Oh, it's a great question. You know, I think when I think about what seems like an intractable problem with the political divide, I'm encouraged by the young people that I come in contact with. I know that sounds like just wait it out, but you know, I have a number of cousins, for example, who kind of come from similar backgrounds as me, and they're much more thoughtful about things. They have friends that are on the other side of issues and whatnot, and they just seem to be, I just find a lot more nuance and recognition of the concerns. You know, it's particularly when it comes to something like climate change. You see these young Republican groups who are like, we got to take climate change seriously, but they may disagree about how they need to address it, but they're not denying it. And so I'm hopeful that some of this is just a time can kind of help with some of that. As far as whether federal, state, and local governments are best suited, I mean, you know, the problem is the polarization is caused, you know, there are certain states who are doing a great job on certain fronts. I mean, I'm in Vermont and they do a great job by their land here, and there's not a Best Buy on every corner, or, you know, which is nice. And, you know, it's different than the Southeast with the billboards and the shopping malls and the wetlands and all the different things that you see. You know, so in that sense, you know, the federal government having federal policies and federal investments in place, which, fingers crossed with the good news from the deal yesterday, that these private investments, you know, and I read an article the other day about EVs. Once you hit 5% of your market in EVs, it takes off, and we're at the 5% point in the US. And if we follow the pattern of nations in Europe and other places, it's just going to take off. And so all these people who are decrying the, oh yeah, you're going to run out of electricity going down the road, you know, it reminds you of the horse and buggy, you know, people who wanted to keep the horse and buggy when the car was around, when the car came out. And so, I'm hopeful that, you know, the federal government can kind of smooth some of those things out. But I think advocating at the state level, and I'll be quiet, but advocating at the state level with your state legislators that this is in their best interest to engage in land use planning that helps move people from the coastal zone because of the threats of flooding. You know, we're seeing in Kentucky and eastern Kentucky. I know that's not on the coast, but, you know, you're dropping a lot more rain per per hour now with more moisture in the atmosphere, and just working at the state level to do better land use planning, I think is critical, because that's where the keys are for land use. So it really just depends. It really just depends on what the issue is, whether federal government or states should be the locus of focus. Oh.
Thank you. Next question. So where do the people fit in who don't accept the other side of morality until they're faced with a personal situation that changes their mind? So for example, forced birth until they themselves need an abortion, anti-LGBTQ+ until their child is gay, against climate change mitigation until their home is destroyed by repeat hurricanes, etc.
You know, that's a good question. Where do you fit those people? I mean, I guess I'm not know that I'm answering that question specifically, but I think that the reason that people are predisposed to be that way is kind of a lack of empathy, which is kind of part of what this accountability and partisanship is that we're behind social media now. We don't actually have to talk to people who are going through difficult challenges, rape victims and things like that. You know, we can isolate ourselves from these things. And so they're stepping into the shoes of someone else and kind of understanding kind of what they're going through is a quality that I think is on the decline. And I think that, you know, that's kind of part of this whole notion of, you know, and it sounds like kumbaya, let's, you know, just fix it. But, you know, we have to start interacting and challenging ourselves to engage with people that are unlike us and that have different worldviews than us, so that we can have more empathy and understanding, and more concern and care. But as far as, you know, so I mean, I think that going back to, and that's why I am encouraged, I said, like, by the younger people that I come in contact with who get that. They seem to get that. They're more relational in that way, and they have a wider swath of friends and life experiences that I think hopefully will help them be able to at least engage with other people in a respectful manner, even if they do end up disagreeing on certain policy positions.
Make for a more docile elephant.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. It's a good way to put it.
Okay, next question. How can we address the issue of like-minded enclaves created by the increased mobility you talked about?
Oh man, I know. The conclusion part of this article is the hardest one I've ever written, because I don't have the answers to that question except to say, you know, what are some workarounds? You know, when I think about like you remember the light bulb thing, like where, you know, they're trying to tell us what light bulbs we can use, and then, you know, Trump was like, let's take away the requirements for these certain light bulbs. Well, at some point the market just takes care of it, and people just think, like, why am I arguing about light bulbs anymore? These are the light bulbs we have. I think that's where we're going to be with EVs eventually. I mean, you know, a lot of gearhead friends of mine are like, I'm like, dude, you know, this car will get up and blow that car with an engine out of the water when it comes to 0 to 60, right? And they're like, yeah, but you know, it's I think short circuiting it, you know, like, it is what it is. People are moving where they're moving, but that's why I think this private sector approaches can help. You know, the companies get it, the CEOs get it. They cannot be isolated from, a lot of them cannot be isolated from their consumers who are all across the political spectrum. And so, you know, it's like that. Jason Clay has it's an older TED talk, but if you get a chance to check it out, about how big brands can save biodiversity. He basically says you have to make these things pre-competitive, so people aren't looking at a product on the shelf that is bad for the environment and one that's good. You only put good products that are good for the environment on the shelf, and then the problem takes care of itself. It doesn't matter what their political affiliations are. And so I think short-circuiting it somehow through private governance is unfortunately one of the more effective approaches.
I was thinking too, it seems to be a helpful shift when there's more to choose from within the better option. Now there's pickup trucks that are EVs, and you are no longer kind of limited to that like weird looking small electric vehicle. You don't feel like you're just being told this is your only option. We've taken away what you like to choose before.
Yeah, more choice. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, one more question. Are there communication strategies or frameworks to help bridge the divide within similar interest groups? How do we organize within ourselves to work together effectively?
This is great. I am hopeful that a great independent party will emerge at some point. And what I mean by that is, I sat down with the head of Sierra, one of the people pretty high up in Sierra Club in Texas, and I was talking to him. I said, you got to engage with people who think Sierra Club is like, whatever their misconceptions are, or stereotypical misconceptions are. And he's like, we know, and we're trying, and we want to be able to engage. And I think we need more ambassadors out there that can self-regulate and go out and say, you know what, I have my personal leanings. But how I'm always shocked at these media people, like on the news, that interview these people with these crazy ideas, and how they don't just get mad at them. Like, how could you believe that? And I'm always shocked at how calm they are at these crazy responses that they get when they're interviewing people. And I think we need more people like that in this policy space to say, you know what, I'm going to remain calm and go out and be an intermediary. I'm going to challenge myself to understand my own political predispositions. I had an interaction with the Dogwood Alliance about the wood pellets. I was like, let's meet, let's talk. I want to talk to you all. We agree on the same thing. We want to protect forests. But I actually just think that we need to be careful about saying that all forest products markets are bad, and because they cause these other problems, therefore the whole industry is bad, as opposed to looking at it a little more carefully. And it was like crickets. There just wasn't an interest in sitting down and talking about it, because I think they view me as the other side, and I'm not. We share the same goal. And so, I think we need more people to be intermediaries, to kind of take that mantle on as their kind of cause, and go out and try to stitch these groups together and have them talk. I think that's a role, and I don't know what that's called, but we need more people doing that.
Yeah. One of the things that I love about our summer program is that we have media fellows that we bring in, and journalists that give talks on these very divisive issues. And I love to learn how they talk about these issues. They're reporting the facts, they're not masking the truth, but they manage to do it in a way that is much less charged.
Right.
We have a lot to learn about that.
Right.
Okay, we're out of time. We got to let people go to their 1 o'clock classes, but thank you so much, Dean Hudson, for your presentation. Thanks to everybody who joined us today. And our next talk will be Tuesday next week. And we'll be wrapping up our summer session next week. So hope to see you then.
Thank you all for the opportunity. Take care.
Bye-bye.